Television, Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. Denice Kronau is somebody well known to many people in this town, if not everybody. She is the chair of the Town Finance Committee, and she recently became co-chair of the Dreamland. But there's a lot more to her story and a lot of things you might not expect. And we're going to talk about all those things in the next half hour or so. Denice, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
I want to start with where you grew up.
I grew up in upstate New York in a small town outside of Troy, east of Troy, and it's called Post-and-Kill.
Post-and-Kill?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a Dutch, I guess. That's
yeah.
Yeah, that's one I've not heard of.
Like a lot of the Hudson Valley.
And did you go to school there?
I went to school, yes, I went to school there. And then at the end of my sophomore year, we moved to the next town over called Britton-Kill. And I went to school there for a year.
Now, where did you go to college and why did you go there?
I started at Albany State, State University of New York at Albany. And when I moved from Post-and-Kill to Britton-Kill, I moved from a class of 300 people to a class of 100. And, it just wasn't a great fit. I mean, nice people and all that, but I ended up leaving high school and going to college a year early, and SUNY Albany was in driving distance of our home. So I could go there, which was good.
And at that point, did you know what you wanted to study there?
No, I had no idea. I mean, I was 16 years old, so I tried everything. I took French history and Italian and the writings of Solzhenitsyn. And the first year was just, gee, this sounds interesting. Maybe I'll take this. And I had no idea. And at one point I thought I might be a lawyer. And then I realized that 7 years of college was way too much after the first year. So I switched to forestry, as one does. And then left after 2 years at Albany State and went to West Virginia University, which has a great forestry school. I spent about 10 minutes out in the woods, wet and cold. And I was like, okay, this is not for me. So my friends are engineers, so I ended up in computer science.
Why were you thinking about being a forest ranger?
I wanted to be the Central Park forest ranger. I thought that would be a really good job.
And well, obviously you didn't stick with that idea, but had you been offered a job other than in Central Park, would you have turned it down?
I hadn't really thought that far ahead, Charlie. I mean, I was 18 years old at the time. It just seemed like a really cool, if you're going to be a forest ranger, why not in Central Park? How fun would that be? And then I realized it was interesting. All my classmates in forestry had been out in the woods their whole life, right? So you could pick up a twig and they could tell you what kind of tree it was. And I'm like, well, it's a twig. I can't tell you what kind of tree this is. So not only was I mistaken in my interest, but I was woefully bad at it. So it was really good. I didn't stick to it.
So you switched your field of interest and you got a degree there.
Yeah, and computers and kind of a combination business administration and computer science degree.
Okay, you've graduated. What did you do upon graduation?
I went to work for Philip Morris, the company that makes Marlboro, in Richmond, Virginia.
And you were doing?
I was a computer programmer. I mean, I was lucky enough. It was interesting. Most of my friends in my dorm were all engineers. And so they're like, oh, take engineering. And I'm like, oh, I can't do 4 classes in calculus. I can barely get through the 1. But computer science seems pretty straightforward. And it was at a timing, sometimes you can just be lucky. It was, if you could spell IBM, you got a job. So then having a computer science degree, I had my pick of jobs. All my friends were struggling to find work, and I had a choice of several different jobs that I could have taken. And I ended up at Philip Morris in Richmond, so as a programmer. And then a series of promotions, and then they moved me to New York City, and then they ultimately moved me to Munich, Germany. So
you covered a lot of ground in that last sentence.
Yeah.
Let me step back, because it always interests me how people get from one thing to another over the course of their lives. Do you see any kind of a through line or a connection or anything at all between wanting to be a forest ranger and ending up in computer science? Not that one can't be interested in 2 totally different things at the same time.
I mean, both had a heavy science basis, right? So to be a forest ranger, you had to take biology, chemistry, all the basics, all the science basics. And I liked the logic of science. And then programming is all about logic. It's getting everything down to 0 or 1, right? That's everything you do ultimately can be answered either yes or no. So if someone asks you, is it a nice day today? And you say, well, I'm thinking about it. Well, is the sun out? Yes. So you can get every kind of question ever asked down to 0 or 1, which is the basis of computer programming. So with that, I just found that was kind of a common thread in terms of, I liked the logic of it. And I liked when things worked. I was pretty good at sitting down and saying, well, here's the problem we have to solve for. And I was very methodical about it. So I guess that's probably what attracted me to it. And it took a lot less calculus. I only had to have 1 class. So.
I would think computer science didn't really exist when I was in college and high school, but I would think that calculus and computer science, if you're good at one, you'd be good at the other. But obviously in your case, that was not true.
Yeah, I just didn't have an affinity for calculus. I was really good at algebra, really good at geometry, but calculus and I we were not friends. So I was just, and the computer science, it was one of the new programs. They hadn't, it may not have existed when you were there, but when I was there, we still had to do punch cards and carry around 800 card decks to run through the card reader. So, and people today say, what's a card reader? I'm like, okay, well, drop an 800 card deck and you'll know what a card reader is. So so as I said, at the time, if you could spell IBM, there was plenty of work, and it was an interesting time because I actually had to write programs that made the computer work. So I had to write in hexadecimal, I had to write in assembly language. So languages that today nobody would have any idea about unless you're one of the deep scientists in some of these computer companies. So.
Well, I have no clue about the languages today, so you can imagine where that puts me. Now, when you took that job with Philip Morris, you just said that there were jobs everywhere at that point.
Yeah.
It was a new field, but did you have that kind of position in mind with that kind of a company, a big, company that everybody has heard about?
Not really. Interestingly enough, I was interviewing with the Navy to work in their Groton, Connecticut submarine to do actually virtual modeling of what it was like to be underwater, to write the software that would allow submariners to test their abilities and to learn. And then I also interviewed with the National Security Agency, which was quite an interesting interview. And I would have gone to coding and cryptology school for 3 years had I joined there. And I just had finished 4.5 or 5 years of college. And I thought, I just can't go another 3 years of college somewhere. And then Philip Morris recruited on campus, and of the companies that recruited, I didn't want to work for IBM. I didn't want to work for a computer company. I wanted to work for a company that physically made something. Though the 2 government jobs were kind of interesting, I have to say, but I ended up at Philip Morris.
And at the point where you took that job, and for that matter, at the point where you were studying all these things in college, how aware were you of the great demand for your knowledge was going to be out there?
Yeah, I had to work full-time through college to pay for school. So I pretty much worked full-time since I was 16. And I was an average student. I was not the top of my class. I was getting some things A's, but mostly B's and the occasional C and the occasional D. And so I graduated with like a B+ average. And there were people knocking on my door to hire me. All my friends in business class were top of their classes and couldn't get jobs. So I was aware that I had lucked into a very valuable skill set at the time. And to be fair, I was good at it. I was actually a good programmer. So my grades didn't reflect it, because when you're working 40 hours a week and trying to go to school full time, it's, at some point you have to sleep, and there are some trade-offs. So.
Well, luck was sort of what I was getting at, or serendipity or happenstance, whatever you want to call it. So you would have been in that field even had you not known that there were going to be job offers
yeah.
coming frequently.
Yeah, when I first started studying it, I really liked it, number one. And number two, you could look ahead at that point and see what people were getting jobs in. But I would have finished in that in any case. So I didn't really go into it with an idea that, oh yeah, let's be a computer scientist because then you're going to get a good job. I went into it to say, let's be a computer scientist because this is kind of interesting and it's still science-based and it's new. And oh, good, I'm going to get a good job. So.
Now, aside from programming, what else did you do at Philip Morris and how long were you there?
I was at Philip Morris 13 years. So I started out as a programmer. And then after that, you become a systems analyst. So, for example, if you were running the finance department, I would sit down with you, Charlie, and say, what kind of information do you need from our systems in order for you to do your job? And you would describe it to me. And then I would go back and write the programs or help people write give projects to the programmers. They would write the programs and we'd sit down and go over the reports that you got. And you'd say, no, I don't like this. And I want this instead. And I want, I need to see this. And we'd go back and do that again. And so then, and then I would just get into bigger and bigger projects, so initially I would be an analyst for one person and then I'd be for a whole department and then, a whole series of systems. And then they moved me to Munich in 1990. And there I did a lot of IT strategy work with all the companies. At that time, Philip Morris had bought Kraft and General Foods and put them together. And the headquarters were based in Europe, in Munich. And so I was doing a lot of strategic projects where I'd go country to country and say, what do you need to do to run your business? What's unique about it? What kind of systems do you have? How old are they? What does the portfolio look like? I do basically portfolio analysis and say where we should invest as a company in terms of upgrading systems.
Now, were those skills you picked up along the way in those 10 years, or had you been trained already for those things when you left college?
I mean, the analytical piece I picked up while working, and I had great colleagues at work that were always happy to help. I mean, I keep saying one of my superpowers is to say, I don't know, right? It's to say, I don't know how to do this. And to ask for help because, no one knows everything. And so with that, they're quite generous about, if you don't know something, I'll help you. And yeah, so I just, I would learn, and because often you're doing things the hard way and then somebody points out a much easier way to do it. And you're like, oh, I've been, how crazy have I been for the last 5 days when I could have just asked for help? So yeah.
Now, is your surname German?
It is. My great grandfather came over from Germany. So no one in my family spoke German when my great grandmother did, but I was 4 when I met her and we hardly did German lessons. So I learned German in school And
did that have a lot to do with the fact that you ended up in Munich at this point?
yes, exactly. That's why I told Philip Morris had offices all over the world. And I said, I want to be moved to Germany as and when that makes sense. And most people aren't mobile, right? Most people want to stay in their hometown, or very few people are willing to move. And so I was always, hey, let me go. I haven't seen anything yet, so let's go.
Denice, when you were in Munich, were you conversing in German or English or both?
Both, Charlie. At the office, we were speaking in English because we had 20 different nationalities in the office. And then outside of the office, it was all in German. And this is Munich in the 1990s. So it was really different than it is today. It wasn't as international as it is today. Stores closed at 6 o'clock, Monday to Friday. They closed at 2 o'clock on Saturdays. Here's a funny story. I'm single at the time, and I drop off my clothes at the dry cleaners at 9:30 because they don't open till 9:30, and then I go into the office, so I'm late to work. And then it takes me almost a month to get back and pick it up because they close at 6 o'clock and I'm working. So I finally get there. And when I get there to pick up my dry cleaning, the woman who runs the place said, "Were you in the hospital this whole month? Why didn't you pick up your clothes?" No, I don't have a wife or a mother or a husband or a helper. I mean, okay, because it was at the time, so many people had a more traditional family structure where there was someone at home, right? And so they did all the admin that could happen between 10 or 9:30 a.m. and 6 p.m. Whereas when you're single, you have to kind of plan better. And that was kind of an eye-opening for me because I came from Manhattan where everything's available 24 hours, right? And then all of a sudden I'm in Munich where I can't get milk on Sunday. And there was places, but my first couple of weeks there were a little bit, oh, I should have figured out food. I guess I'll be eating out all day today. So
It sounds just a little bit like Nantucket 50 years ago when I first came here to live year-round, believe it or not. It's sure not that way today. Now, how long were you in Munich with Philip Morris?
So I was in Munich until 93, and then I went to work for Grand Metropolitan, which is now Diageo. So it's the company that makes Guinness and Bailey's and Smirnoff and J&B and all those good things. So I went to London from there and was with them, and they also then moved me from London to Paris and then back to London. So I'd say most of my career, I've worked mostly outside the US.
And how's your French?
Not great. I
Sure.
mean, je m'appelle Denice, je suis fatiguée. My name is Denise, I'm tired. I I learned food words quite quickly and taxi words.
So it wasn't necessary for your job, obviously.
No, again, for Grand Met Foods Europe, who I worked for at the time, it was again English because again, international office.
And what were you doing?
At that time, I was the financial controller for the business. So we were a foods business based in Europe and probably no brands that most people would recognize in the US. They were all local country brands. And I was the corporate controller reporting to the finance director.
And how natural a switch was that from computer science?
What happened was when I was doing computer science, I was writing all the financial systems. And analyzing the financial systems and mostly around finance. So when somebody said, well, you know what, you could be a controller. And I'm like, well, I don't have an accounting degree and I don't have any accounting credentials, which is usually required for a controller. I'm like, yeah, but you understand systems and processes and that's what we need to worry about. And your team has those skills. So it was one thing I watched your interview with Jamie, and he pointed out that you find out what you do well and you do it, and then you surround yourself with people who do the other things well that you're not good at. And it's really true. It's probably one of the biggest truths of being successful at anything is, I keep telling people I live by Alf, find out what you don't do well and don't do it. And find the people with you who are good at things.
Jamie, by the way, is Jamie Siminoff, who I interviewed about 6 or 8 months ago. He began the company Ring and also appeared in a lot of the advertisements on television. Now, how long did you stay with that company?
I was there 5 years. I was there for 5 years. And then at that point, I took a short leave of absence. I had several jobs. I was a controller for a couple of years. And then we had a big restructuring project for Europe. And I was the co-lead for that project. And then after that, once the project was done, there was a couple of good jobs, but I had then just gotten married and Michael and I were going to be based in Germany. So we had been commuting the entire time we dated every weekend. And so with that, we decided to live in the same place. That'd be an interesting idea. So I then left Grand Metropolitan, which was then Diageo, and went home to Germany. And after about 2 months at home, I was like, okay, I'm going back to work. I'm going back to work. So.
Did you really think of that as a retirement or just a time off for an indeterminate period?
It was really just a short interlude. I mean, I knew I was never going to not work at that point. I was too young to not work. And it was just a question of finding something. And interestingly enough, the work I found was to continue to do the big restructuring projects. However, with a small boutique consultancy firm that back in those days, this was 1998, said you could work virtually as long as you're willing to travel to the client. And we have tons of European clients. So Denise, if you're based in Central Europe, you're fine. So it worked out great.
Well, this, again, let me stop because this is what I find, one of the things I find so interesting about this. You would think that to be a controller of a big firm, you would have to have all sorts of degrees and courses
Yep.
that you did not have. And it's somewhat counterintuitive these days. Everyone is specialized in one thing or another.
Yep.
And you got to where you were, even at this relatively early stage, by, as you say, saying you didn't know how to do something and then learning how to do it and getting the right people to teach you how to do it. It didn't matter that you didn't have an MBA from Harvard Business School or whatever it is. Hard work and intelligence does pay off.
And
anyway.
also too, Charlie, I think one of the things that I noted at the time, so here I am, the controller, and I don't have accounting. I mean, I have basic accounting, but I don't have the high level accounting qualifications. And the person who was the head of accounting who reported to me, he hated reporting to me because I didn't have the qualifications. He just felt that, I'm reporting to someone who's not as qualified as I am. And so every day he'd come into my office and ask me a very technical accounting question that I couldn't possibly know. So I would say, well, Dave, how would you handle this? So knowing how to ask questions also helps. So he would then say, and I said, well, is there any reason what could go wrong with what you just said? And he's like, and he would then toddle off. Finally, by the 5th day of doing this, I walked into his office and I said, explain to me why making me feel stupid every day is in your best interest. Just tell me, help me understand that. And he's like, oof. And I'm like, of course I know what you're doing. But in the parent company is the best accounting person in England. I mean, call him every day and ask these questions if you want to do this kind of discussions about accounting. I don't care who you call. And after that, it went really smoothly, but it was interesting because instead of pretending I knew more than he did, which I did not, and instead of just, slowly simmering, I just asked him, why does making your boss feel stupid? Why is that a good idea? I'm struggling here. And that was kind of funny.
Well, now you're getting into management skills. And again, you didn't study management when you were in college. This is something you developed along the way.
Yeah.
And now when you rejoined the workforce after your 2-month sabbatical, what were you doing?
I was doing consulting to European companies about how to restructure all their finance activities. So
companies such as?
Sarah Lee, actually Tupperware, funnily enough. I was spending a lot of time in Orlando, Florida, but focusing on their European businesses. Tupperware, as we called it in German. So those kind of companies were the two that I worked with the most.
And how long were you doing that sort of thing?
Let me think. I did that for 4 years. 4 years. And then I was recruited by Siemens, the big German conglomerate. I always call them the German GE because that's what people, they trains and wind turbines and medical equipment. And in fact, at the hospital, the new hospital, it's all Siemens diagnostic equipment, the x-rays, the lab work, it's all kind of cool. So so I worked for Siemens then. I was recruited to come join Siemens in the US, which was kind of funny because I was based in Germany and they were bringing an American back to the US.
So at that point, did you move back to the US at that point?
I did. I moved back to, I was in, I actually was working in New Jersey and I lived in Hoboken. So.
And how long did that last?
I was there until 2005. So, and then I took a 6-month sabbatical and then ended up back at Siemens, back in Germany again.
And what was your position, your title or whatever at Siemens?
Yeah, so when I was at Siemens in 2002, I was the president and CEO of their shared services business in the US. So it was about $100 million business, 500 employees. And then when I came back, I did some special projects for about 9 months. And then after that, I was the CEO and head of their global shared services business, which was 8,000 employees around the world. So, yeah.
That's a long way from being a forest ranger in Central Park.
Absolutely.
But to pick up on what we were talking about a minute ago, you are living proof that if you don't have an MBA from Harvard, so what? But
Yeah.
also, it says a lot about your employers that they didn't feel that, uh, they didn't feel that you had to have, they didn't feel you had to have that MBA from Harvard or whatever.
I mean, a couple lucky breaks, Charlie, as well, you know, which is,
But to be lucky, it's got to be good. I mean, if they
yeah, gotta be
had
good.
a good track record behind you, they wouldn't have gone near you, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Now, you're kind of a story, which I hope I haven't belabored over the last 30 minutes. How unusual is that in the upper echelons of the corporate world?
I'm probably just on the cusp of the generation that there was a lot of people, maybe, let's say the folks who are 10 years older than I was, were more like me. You know, they all just kind of scrappily came up through the companies. 10 years after me, you needed the MBA or nobody would talk to you. And so I was kind of on the cusp and in the right industry to not need the pieces of paper and top of the class to get good jobs or to get the best jobs, I guess I would say. Also, too, I mean, what's the phrase? The harder I work, the luckier I get. So, I mean, that part too, I made a lot of choices during my work career to be away from home for weekends, to travel 60, 70% of the time, to basically have no life outside of work because I, number one, liked the work, but also two, felt a responsibility to do my best at it. And that's what I felt it required. And so, I mean, all those things together. And I think the other piece of it, Charlie, is always when somebody presented me with an opportunity, I would always ask, why not? Why wouldn't I want to do this? You know, what is it about this that I might not like? Because I was often offered things that no one had done before. So there was no precedence of how this job should work or what it should look like. And I would sit there and go, okay, well, I don't want to live in that place in England. So this job I'm going to say no to. But I'd say of all the jobs I was offered, I'd say I took 95% of them because I could always find something that was interesting about them and different. And I've made lateral moves. You know, it's not a ladder. And people think it's a ladder. It's not. It's, you know, there's a lot. I made lateral moves. I even took some steps backwards at one point because it was interesting work and I got to know different groups of people. And so I didn't worry always, is the title bigger? You know, I didn't always worry about that. So, yeah.
Knowing what you know now and keeping in mind all the success you had with your individual path, do you wish you had that MBA?
No. I wish I had accounting credentials. That would have helped a lot. But no, I never, at one point, actually, I was accepted at the, not INSEAD, the other one that's based in Europe. I was accepted for an MBA school and the company was going to pay and go ahead and do it. And I just thought, really, I'm working a lot and I've got such interesting work. Do I now want to add this on just to say I have it? I'm doing okay. So, yeah. And not to say you shouldn't get one. I mean, I'm sure there's tons of interesting things you learn. I'm sure there's tons of things that I missed out on or could have done better earlier had I had that education. I'm not dismissing an MBA at all, not at all. It wasn't right for me.
So you're a CEO at Siemens, and how long did you stay there?
So I did that. I did that from 2002 to 2005, took a sabbatical, came back. And in 2000, I think it was I have to check, 2007, or no, 2006. I can't remember. They made me the CEO globally. And then at the same time, about a year later, they asked me to be the CFO of Siemens in the US, which at the time was a $20 billion business. So I then had two jobs. I had the CEO of Global Shared Services and the CFO of Siemens US. And that was an interesting job because, you know, we focused at the time on healthcare, energy, and mobility, and then infrastructure things. So.
And how long did you do that?
I did that until 2010, and then they asked me to be the CFO of our healthcare diagnostics division. I was very much a good soldier. If you said, Denice, we need you to go do this, I would say, woof, a couple of times I was like, woof. But at the same time, if you need me to do it and I'm the logical person to go do it, then okay, I'll go take that job. So whilst I liked being the CFO of the US organization overall, they needed me to go work for a particular division within one of the businesses. And so I then went and did that for a year and a half. And then I got it to a certain, I often got put into things that needed fixing. And so once they were fixed, then it was time to go do something else. And so then I would, my last role at Siemens was as the global chief diversity officer based out of Germany, based out of Munich. So then I moved back to Germany. So
something else you've done is to write 2 books. Tell us about those.
Thanks, Charlie. I wrote 2 books. The first one's a nonfiction book, and it's a series of essays talking about basically how to be happy at work. At one point during my career, I was working so much, and the way I was working was not productive. I'd get a lot of things done, but my example is I'd fly from New York to India for a board meeting, turn around the same day, come back, that evening. And so, that's just crazy to spend that much time traveling for a 4-hour meeting. So during that time, I got a little bit burnt out. And then I started writing a series of essays about what I liked about working and asking myself questions about what was important to me. And then that ended up I started a website and a blog, and then that all ended up being in my first book, and that's called Falling in Love with Work, a practical guide to reigniting your passion for your career. The second book actually is a novel about Nantucket, about Abigail and Matthew, who lived on Nantucket in the 1850s, and then again in 2008. They were living in Boston and Nantucket and got to know each other. And it alternates every other chapter, and it's about a woman who's running her family business. It's about a man who's a sea captain. It's really, I've done a lot of research into the history of Nantucket, and the stories and the thoughts of what it must have been like at that time just enchanted me. And, Nantucket was so progressive, so much more progressive than the mainland was in terms of so many topics, in terms of women being really equal in the family, and the Quakerism, and abolishing slavery 100 years before the mainland did. And so all those things just interest me, and I wanted to weave them together into a novel. And that novel is called The World is Decorated with Stars.
And now I want to be clear on this. Had you retired before or after you wrote?
No, I wrote the first book, the nonfiction book. I wrote that while I was still working. And that kind of, I had a job where I traveled all the time, and I was home not that often. So I'd often be weekends away, and you can only go to so many museums and walk through so many parks. So I just started writing, and I like to write. I don't know if I'm that good at it, but I enjoy it. So, and writing is one of those very portable things you can do. And then the novel had been kicking around in my head probably for 15 years. And finally, I just decided it was time to write it. And it sort of wrote itself. It was kind of fun. And then that got actually published after I retired. So, but the most of the writing was done while I was still commuting back and forth to the island and still working at my full-time jobs.
You anticipated my question, which is, where did you find the time to do all this? But you've already answered that, so I don't have to ask you again. Where can one buy these books?
They're on Amazon. So they're both on Amazon. Yep. And
will there be a third or a fourth book?
There will be in the novel series. So Abigail and Matthew will, actually it's their children will be in book 3. And Abigail and Matthew from modern times will stay in the book. And then my hope is that the third book will be all of their parents. So back to the late 1700s and the 1960s. That's my idea. So I wanted to do a 3-book series. So let's see, I'm up to chapter 5 on the second book, but it isn't writing itself like the first one did. So
how soon can we see these?
The second book is probably, I'm guessing if I'm lucky, it'll be done by June. So if I'm
June of
lucky,
2022. In case
yes.
somebody's seeing this 5 years from now.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So you had multiple top positions in the corporate world
Hmm.
for a long period of time. And you retired well in advance of retirement age,
Yeah.
and you ended up on Nantucket. And why aren't you bored to death?
It's why am I bored to death? I find lots of different kinds of things interesting. So my first couple of years, as I said, I worked full time since I was 16. So when I did take early retirement, I didn't wear a watch for 2 years, Charlie. I wouldn't even get my nails done because it was an appointment at a fixed time. Having to be somewhere all the time, even though, okay, of course there was vacations in the middle of all this, but still most of the time I had to be somewhere. I just wanted to do nothing. So I did kind of nothing the first couple of years here, just enjoyed going to the beach and reading. I like to knit, so I knit a lot. And then I then decided I wanted to do something, get involved in the community at a more concrete level. And Melissa Murphy and Jennifer Cohen had started We Can, which is Women Engaged in Civic Action on Nantucket, shortly after the 2016 election. And so then I went to a couple sessions there and thought, finance committee, that might be interesting. So I sent my resume to each one of the select board members at the time and asked to see them and explained why I wanted to be on finance committee. And they're like, yeah. So I applied and was appointed to finance committee. So that was my idea of getting more involved. And the reason why finance committee, because people have asked me before, and, would you ever run for select board? And I have huge respect for our select people. And I like numbers, numbers tell a story. So I really enjoy being on finance committee. I very much enjoy my colleagues on finance committee. Each one's got a great background and interesting story to tell. And I like to see, a community invests in, I think Nantucket votes and invests its values. So that's another reason I enjoy doing that here. So that's a very long-winded answer to why I'm not bored, because finance committee takes quite a bit of time.
I want to talk more about the finance committee, but first I want to ask you, why Nantucket?
Oh, we came here, Michael, my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, we visited my parents in upstate New York for 4th of July in '97. Then we came here for 5 days and stayed at the Roberts House Inn. The following summer, no, in '96. And then in '97, we came the following summer and rented a house on Low Beach Road for 2 weeks. And then, Michael and I were always moving for our jobs. I think I've moved 25 times. And so if you ever need help moving, I am very good at it, by the way. I'm very good at throwing away Michael's things. They seem to fall off the truck in between our moves. But he always asks me, do you know where this is? And I'm like, I'm sure it's somewhere, knowing I had thrown it away like 3 moves ago. But, in the universe, it is somewhere. It's just not somewhere we own. I forgot the question. Oh, why Nantucket? So we were moving so much for our jobs, and I didn't want to own a house everywhere we went. So I just said, why don't we buy a house on Nantucket? And if we want to, when we're of the age to retire, maybe we'll retire there. And if we don't, then we'll sell it and retire wherever we need to retire. So that's how because we both loved it. Like many people who come here, we both loved it and thought, and I kiddingly say, I said, well, realize I have a, American education in geography. So I think Nantucket is halfway between the United States and Germany. My husband's German. So I said, it's halfway, it's halfway. He's smart. He realizes it's nowhere near halfway, but that's okay.
Yeah, to me, it's halfway between the U.S. and I don't know where.
Exactly.
A place that's exactly like this. You can find a piece of it here and a piece of it there, but all the pieces together in one place, you're not going to find it. Let's go back to the finance committee. We're taping this at the end of November, and you either have just started or are about to start the either best or worst part of the year for being a member of the finance committee. When you get rolling between now and the town meeting, which is going to be in April, How many nights a week are you potentially meeting?
So it all depends on how many. So for example, last year we had 112 warrant articles, the year before 117, 50 plus citizens warrant articles both years. So that takes quite a lot of time and multiple meetings. So we'll meet 2 or 3 times a week, starting in January, right up until the beginning of March, when we have to finalize our recommendations for the warrant. So yeah, we start December 9th with the first public hearing on the citizen warrant articles that were submitted, and we go from there. So, yep.
A lot of people in town, I think I'm one of them, would think that this is in many ways the toughest job in Nantucket, even though it doesn't go 12 months a year. You're not meeting every week for the whole year.
No.
But while you are meeting, it's a huge amount of time. And for a lot of the people on the committee, this is in addition to their 9-to-5 job.
Exactly.
So this is not for the faint-hearted.
No, and I mean, I think everyone who's on it is, my experience of working with all of them is very willing to serve, put the time in, they understand the importance of it. I don't know that it's the toughest. I wouldn't say select board's an easy job, right? I think there's a lot of not easy jobs on Nantucket, but it's part of what I love about the engagement is, and I always say, democracy is not for sissies. You have to consider all points of view. You have to really think them through. You think them through both in the short term and the long term. You try to balance what you know today with what potentially, what could happen in the future. And you do the best you can, and you make recommendations. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what the voters want to do. So we put a lot of time and effort in. I personally chase everyone who submits an article and gets them to come to finance committee. So then that way we make sure we hear from everyone and we hear their point of view. And yeah, it's interesting. It's just interesting. I find all this stuff quite engaging in terms of what it takes to be part of a community, and also what makes a community run.
I started going to town meetings in 1972. And that was the year they passed zoning. There was no zoning and no building code prior to 1972, which sounds almost like science fiction today.
It does.
But I've noticed over the years, and I've got no other municipality to compare this to because this is the only place I've lived all those years. It seems to me that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the voters follow finance committee recommendations. Not always.
Not always. Not always. Often. Yeah.
Given your background and given your love of numbers, you're the ideal person to be on the committee and sharing the committee for that matter. I'm sure there are, actually, I'm not sure who in my experience has the qualifications and the background that you have to bring to this job. So I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you, but there's other members on our committee that I think would be very good as chair as well. So it's, I kind of took over when David stepped aside and sort of short notice. Yes, and David stepped aside on short notice. And then basically the committee, I've said, I've got a couple of things I'd like to do while the chair, and then somebody else wants to be chair. I'm more than happy to, relinquish the seat. I don't need to be in it forever. So, yeah.
Before we go, you said you start to meet on December 9th.
Yeah.
And this process goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. If somebody wants to know when a particular article is coming up for discussion or coming up in a hearing, how will they find that out?
So we have been last year. What we started doing, which was different than prior years, is we posted which articles we were going to discuss on the agenda. So the agenda, as you know, is posted on the town website. So on the town website is the schedule of all the finance committee meetings. And then 3 days prior, the agenda is posted. And on the agenda, we also put down what articles that we're discussing. However, we can discuss any article at any one of our meetings, because if someone wants to discuss it, it's part of the agenda. It's one of the agenda items, any discussion in respect. For the people who've sponsored citizen warrant articles, I send them emails and assign them dates and ask them to be on these dates to discuss their articles, to make sure that we hear from them, that they, that we get to hear points of view and why they're proposing the articles that they're proposing. But the best way to know would be on, and I kind of work that out ahead of time, but then as you can imagine, people's availability and work schedules, blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit of a moving feast. So the best way to know is look at the agenda 3 days before the Finance Committee meeting, and you'll see which articles are potentially going to be discussed. So.
And where do the public meetings take place these days?
Right now we're on Zoom, and I will stay on Zoom till the end of December, and then if we decide to go back to be in person, it will be at the public safety facility at Fairgrounds Road. So I'm not sure if we'll go back in person yet, Charlie, only because we get really good participation on Zoom. So I haven't seen how it works in the hybrid meeting where people are physically present and there's Zoom. If that works well, then potentially we'll be doing that as well. We haven't decided that yet.
And I think you also have meetings where the public is not invited. Am I correct?
No, all our meetings are always public.
Okay, they're all public meetings.
Yeah. Yeah, that's select committee has executive session, but finance committee does not. So all our meetings are always public.
Well, thanks to all of you for doing all this work. Even if you like numbers, it must be a strain at times, but you don't have to answer that. You don't have to answer that.
Well, like anything, right? Like anything, there's good and bad days. And but I have to say most of the days are good. And I really appreciate my finance committee colleagues. Each one brings such a unique perspective. And, whilst I have the technical qualifications, we have many long-term Nantucket people. And it's just really interesting to me to hear their stories and how things fit. So.
Denice Kronau, thank you for coming on Profiles. And thank you for going through your career almost year by year. It's fascinating to hear. And things were never as cut and dried as we think they might be. And you're a good example of that. So thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. Nice to see you.
Good to see you as well. For Profiles on Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again.